Shift podcast. This is Arjun Nidigallu. That great bit of music you hear at the beginning and the end of each of our episodes is a track called Timestamp, and it was composed, produced, and generously donated to us by today's guest on the show, Tushar Apte. Tushar is a musician, producer, songwriter, and composer based in Los Angeles. He has written and produced many brilliant songs like Zero with Chris Brown, Home with BTS, Sober with Demi Lovato, No Candle, No Light with Zayn, Malik and Nicki Minaj. His latest track is called Ghost, which Tushar wrote and produced with Noah Cyrus. Yet another brilliantly written song that is full of soul and meaning. All this success certainly didn't come easy. At the age of 25, Tushar decided to leave his home in Sydney and landed in LA with nothing more than a dream. In this conversation, we talk about his inspiring, transformative journey. From finding his passion, to forging relationships, to identifying and seizing opportunities, and really persisting with challenges well before he saw all this success. To help us understand a bit more about his actual work, Tushar was kind enough to record a production masterclass for us, in which he runs through the creative process behind the Atomic Shift podcast theme music. As we recorded this masterclass, however, we felt that it would be ideal to present it as a video rather than on the podcast itself, so that you can actually see Tushar's studio screen and learn a bit about how he weaves his magic. So you'll find that video on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/atomicshift. Just a quick note here before we dive right into it. This was recorded before the protests took hold in the US recently, and hence there is no mention of that issue in this episode. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Tushar Apte. So Tushar, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
No, it's great to have you with us. Before we get into it, I must first thank you for donating your track Timestamp for us to use as our theme music. It's been a phenomenal track for us and we're getting so much good feedback about it. Our listeners are loving it. So thank you so much for it.
Oh, anytime. I mean, I've been new to the whole, even just listening to podcasts and everything. So I've also been wrapping my head around and listen to what music I feel like works. And so when I really believe in something, I'm just going to jump in and help out wherever I can. And this was one of those times.
Yeah, and it also sets the mood for us as well. So it lifts it all up a notch, which is really good. So thank you for that. But firstly, how are you and how are you managing the current COVID situation in LA?
I'm good. It's like such a strange and interesting time to be in music during this time, because in so many ways the music business is really, it's a people business, and so much of it is about that energy in the room when you're working in the room. So this has been an interesting exercise, how to do that. There's two kind of perspectives that I feel like I've learned from this thing. One is that people actually being in the same place physically, it still matters. You know what I mean? It's still no matter how much we talk about, or the world has become smaller because you can Skype and Zoom and we can do all those things over that. There's still that thing about, it's just an inherent thing, right? We have to physically be around other people. I think being on the side of recorded music, meaning like we're the people who write and produce the songs, where we've been very fortunate that we are able to continue to work and continue to write, because a lot of what we do is in sort of smaller situations in studios, and I can do a lot of work from home. I can mix, I can write, I can come up with ideas and stuff. And during this time, obviously content is sort of the constant, you know, people are going to constantly be consuming stuff. So there's still a lot of activity on the recorded side of music, but the live side has definitely been hit really, really hard. Like obviously agencies, venues, staff, and even down to industries that sort of support that side of the business, you know, catering, security services, ticketing, printing businesses, like all of these have been absolutely, you know, clobbered during this time. But we're lucky to be on this side where we're actually creating the stuff that can still exist in the lockdown. And in the same way, everything's so interlinked. Every industry is finding that everything's so connected to itself. So even though I'm working on a couple of pretty big projects at the moment, the artists that I'm working with, they're not going to really be able to put most of that music out, because they have to be able to go out and perform it live and to go on Jimmy Kimmel and to do the late night rotation of promo. So none of that is happening now. So everything's quite linked. So even though we can work and, you know, we're still doing deals on the songs and stuff like that, nothing really matters until it's out. So, you know, our fortunes are also tied to everything else. As much as we are able to do what we do from home during this time.
Yeah, well, let's hope things bounce back very quickly for you and everyone involved. So, look, I just want to start with a bit of your overview of your childhood and early influences. You know, talking about how you got to find yourself in the space that you are in right now, just to give our listeners a bit of an idea, if you will.
Yeah, so I'm an only child. Neither of my parents are professional artists as such, but they're both very, very creative and artistic, and we have a very, very strong sort of line of music related art on both sides. My dad is quite a well-known Indian classical singer in Sydney, and he's got three sisters, and they all sing. They're all incredible. And then on my mum's side, she's a doctor by profession, but she's a very accomplished dancer as well. And on their side of the family, we also have a lot of poets and artists and all kinds of people. In fact, my grand uncle is Vasant Bapat, who's he's one of the big figures in theatre and in literature in Maharashtra. And he was, I think, him and Pula Deshpande are sort of the two sort of heavyweights of their era. And so we have that as far as like people who are, I guess, in show business. But yeah, both of my parents very, very creative. My dad definitely more on the Indian side, and he grew up in a very traditional Maharashtrian household, whereas my mom was she was from an army family. Her dad was a lieutenant in the army, so she had a lot more exposure to sort of the Western side and to a lot of the Western music of that time. One of the defining things of our house growing up was that there was always music going on, like as far back as young as I can remember, you know, whether it was my dad practicing or my mom practicing her dance stuff. And then a lot of my early influences on the Western pop side kind of come from records that my mom had, or, you know, a lot of it's like Billy Joel and Stevie Wonder and Michael Jackson. And I always remember growing up around music. And, you know, one of the things about growing up in a house where there's constantly music is it's literally like when you grow up speaking another language, right? And for me, music is like another language. It's about communication, and it's about expressing something where the words alone aren't going to do that sort of function. So I think I've always just innately understood it on that level.
Right, and I do want to drill more into that philosophy of music, and that's a great way to look at it. Music as a language, you know, it actually helps you communicate mood and emotion and ideas in a completely different medium almost. So I do want to talk about all that, but right now, where you find yourself creatively, do you find that those early childhood influences, do you see those influences having a really big impact?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, I can see there's sort of three very distinct phases, I think, in terms of musically. And this is not just me. I think this goes for people who even aren't in music, but if you're just a listener of music, you have three different phases. So there's the music you grow up with, which for me was the Michael, Stevie, a lot of that sort of stuff, mainly of my parents' era, I guess, Billy Joel and Elton and all that kind of stuff. Even on the musical side, it's like my parents used to have like Liberace and Richard Clayton and all these kind of people from the 80s. And then in my, you know, when I was a teenager and you start curating your own music, it's about, okay, what's cool? So that's when I started listening to some of the sort of more risque stuff. It was like a lot of Prince, and then hip hop was just hitting the mainstream at the time. So I was very, very heavily into that, metal even. And then when I started thinking about, okay, I want to be like a credible musician, I had this whole other phase where I was very much into jazz stuff. That was when I was teaching myself the piano. So jazz is like John Coltrane, more specifically into jazz piano players, so to Oscar Peterson. And there's this French guy, Jacques Lussier, and he has this trio, the Jacques Lussier trio, and they used to fuse Bach and Debussy sort of classical pieces with jazz. And when I heard it for the first time, it was just the most incredible, like, mind-blowing thing I'd ever heard. And I thought that was the bridge for me of, oh, that's the stuff I really like, where it can draw on something that has like a technical chops, but then it brings it into the language of popular culture. So that's when I sort of started getting into the more that side of music stuff that was a bit more esoteric and interesting. And then after that whole phase where everything gets really sophisticated and complicated, and you almost have especially as a musician, you almost take this, it's like an uppity sort of attitude, you know, you have towards music. Like you think, oh, my tastes are so much more sophisticated than yours, you know. It's that sort of, it's almost like the elitism that comes with like when you get really, really good at music, I think. And then I sort of, you know, in the sort of long cycle of things, when I was starting to move into the professional world of professional music, everything started getting pared back and dialing it down. And then I almost found myself full circle back to the music I listened to as a child, which was like, you know, popular songs that are sophisticated in the simplicity. But the beauty of them is that they're able to communicate those things to literally millions of people, and they become the soundtrack to people's lives. And that's kind of the spot where I found myself wanting to be, and where I am right now, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's quite fascinating how we interpret music differently depending on where we are in life and what kind of experiences we've had. So sometimes the stuff we listen in our childhood, we go back and listen to it now, we've got a completely different appreciation and approach to that music. I know some of it's nostalgia, but also technically, I'm sure from your point of view, you would pick up new things that you hadn't picked up when you were a kid.
Oh yeah, I mean technically, and then there's even on a different level, there's stuff like, you know, you're not really listening to lyrics necessarily when you're a kid, and then when you're older and you hear certain lyrics, you're like, how were kids singing that? Like, kids shouldn't be singing those lyrics. That's so strange.
Yeah. For me, it was AC/DC. For me, growing up, listening to those songs, it was just about the music. And then when I got old enough to understand what they were actually talking about in some of those songs, I was like, wow, this is really racy stuff. I used to listen to this with my dad. I mean, this is not appropriate at all.
No, I mean, when you listen to songs like Under the Bridge, and even you know, I'll Be Watching You by Sting, it's like about a stalker. It's a stalker song. Under the Bridge is about a heroin addict under a bridge in Silver Lake, which is like 15 minutes from where we live right now. And it's things like that you just don't really catch until you listen to it later. But that's the beauty of it, right? It's like when you watch The Simpsons, and there's just layers to it that you get when you're an adult, you know?
No, it's a really good point. And when was it that, you know, you say you decided to become a credible musician? What age was that for you?
I use that term like very, very loosely, by the way.
Fair enough.
I think it was a dream. You know, I don't think I ever had the discipline from a technical standpoint to be like a concert piano player or whatever. But I think I just wanted to be a really adventurous musician. You know, like I always felt like the stuff that I listened to from Prince or Sly and the Family Stone or like was pop, but also very experimental.
Right. At what age did you realize that this is the dream, you know, this is the goal for you?
Oh, wow, that just hit me, and I sort of felt like 4 different waves of answers to this question. But the strange thing was growing up in Sydney in that environment with that sort of social structure, it never occurred to me that music could even be a profession. It wasn't even a slight thought. I loved doing music. I would literally always be doing it or thinking about it, or, you know, being obsessed with something related to it. But I don't think I ever thought, oh, maybe I could really, really do this. You know, there was a point in high school where I was in a band and we would play, but the idea around doing it professionally never really happened until later on. And I think it was just because I literally didn't know that was a thing you could do. Just plain and simple, you know, it's something that I sort of figured out on my own later on. And also, yeah, it was being in the environment in Sydney, which I always felt was so stifling, but I didn't know how to get out of it, in the sense that I felt like I never fit in with even my closest friends. I was an arts student, and they were all doing these sort of really professional degrees, you know, commerce and law and medicine. And I always felt, you know, when you're in that environment, people look down on art students. You feel that sort of weird condescension. You feel that implicit condescension towards what you do. Or like, you don't have anything going on with your life. Like, you don't know what you're going to do. You know, you feel that, even if it's not an explicit thing. But within the context of that environment, I never thought this was a thing until much later on. So it wasn't an idea. There were a couple of occasions where definitely my parents tried to steer me away from the idea of that, and I only see that in hindsight. You know, I think they were just concerned.
Yeah, of course. And I think there's a lot of concern from the community point of view as well, because, you know, you and I share this probably. We belong to a community that reveres academic achievements in a very traditional way. In terms of, you know, not knowing that could be a thing, I think that might have actually helped, because in many cases that helps you almost organically evolve into something that without that physical goal of reaching whatever it is.
Yeah, well, one of those, and it's only something that I see now in hindsight, and I have, I'm fortunate to sort of even be talking to you on the other side of this, where I've had some success in the real business. But when I think back on it, and I only really thought about this when I was sort of prepping some of my notes for this interview, but in hindsight, one through line during my life has always been that no matter how much I tried to be a model citizen, and I really tried, so to speak, I was academically pretty good. No matter how much I tried to be that good, responsible sort of Indian boy, whatever you want to call it, opportunities to be involved in music just kept falling into my lap, and it was almost like I was getting signs, and it took me a few years to realize that, when you see sort of signs coming to you or something, this is something I should pursue, is when stuff starts to gravitate itself towards you and you have to just go for it. That took me a while to find that.
No, that's a really good way of putting it. I mean, there's a famous saying about how books find you. You don't find books, right?
Oh, it's so true. It's so true. And it's so real. And that's why when you asked me the question, it just hit me then, because I think I really tried to go get a straight job, and I inherently knew that wasn't for me. That's not to speak about anyone. I just have always known that was not for me. But at the same time, I didn't know how to get out of it, because that is how crushing that whole environment feels like, at that point.
Yeah, it's a great insight into the pressures of trying to be the stock standard, achiever. And maybe this is a good segue into your move to LA. How did that come about, and what kind of courage did it take for you to make that decision and just shift shop?
Yeah, I think in terms of two sort of critical things that happened that eventually led me to move to LA, but definitely led me mentally down the path of, there is like a real industry, there is a way to work in this business and to make it a professional thing. Because up until probably my third year of uni, like I said, I had no exposure to this. I didn't know anybody who was in music. There was no one in my family. There's like no precedent for this in my environment growing up. And so there were two sort of critical things that happened that would sort of lead me down this road. One was in my fourth year of uni, I was supposed to finish my degree, but I was doing all kinds of stuff. I was just like busy hanging out, and I was going out and doing all the thing and wasting a lot of time. And I actually failed my last semester of uni. I was supposed to finish in 4 years. I failed. So I had to do one extra semester. Obviously, my parents were absolutely like devastated that I wasn't going to finish on time. And, on top of that, even with my degree, which is a psychology degree with an English major, I had no idea of what I wanted to do afterwards. To do a professional psychology thing, it's a whole nother set of degree, and I wasn't ever that good at it. I think I was really just passing. Anyway, so I'm failing my degree. I have to do an extra semester, and by coincidence, the Sydney University Conservatorium and the music department, they had just started a new course which was catered towards musical performance. And for the first time, it was a course that wasn't just for classically trained musicians. It was like something that they had geared towards like classical and contemporary performers. And it was an elective. So I needed an elective to finish my degree. So I go to the audition, and it's the head teacher of the course, and her name's Winsome Evans, and she's one of the really, really important people in my life. And she is one of the foremost like scholars of Baroque music, and so very specific music of like the Baroque period. And she's an incredible musician herself. She plays literally everything, and she plays even ancient instruments and stuff like that. So she was auditioning this thing, but at the same time, she also really loved contemporary music. So she loved Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix and Luther Vandross. Like, she loved all this stuff. And so I go to the audition, and I played two songs. I played one song on the piano. I think it was like the Hungarian Dance or something. It was like a Brahms thing, classical thing. And then I played and sang a Billy Joel song. And she goes, at the end of the audition, she goes, have you like really learnt how to play the piano? And I said, oh no, I just sort of taught myself. She goes, don't ever play the piano for me again. I never want to hear you play the piano. Like, you're not good enough. And she goes, she recommended me a book, and she goes, you should do this Hanon book. The Hanon book is like a famous book of scales where it sort of helps you get your technical chops up. So she goes, take Hanon and learn that. And I thought at this point, I'm like, I'm not going to get into this course. I'm like, I really want to do this music thing. I'm not getting in. And then she goes, but that second thing you did, where you sang and you played the song, I think you got something. I think you know songs. So I'm going to let you in this course, So she lets me in, and that group of people was, after years and years of all this stuff we're talking about, even some of my closest friends on, in our family friend circle, all that stuff, I just felt like I didn't get them and they didn't get me. You know what I mean? As close as we were, as much time as we spent together, I just did not fit in. They were playing cricket on the weekends. I couldn't be less interested in all that stuff. I just wanted to play music and be like artistic and shit. So I get into this class, and all of a sudden, within a few weeks, there's like 10 people in the class, a very small class. And the way the course is structured is every week you prepare a performance, and, half the class was, what we called contemporary musicians. So we were the singer-songwriters, and then the other half were the classical musicians. So there were some piano players, some violinists, and different, all amazing musicians. But all of a sudden, more than anything else, we found each other. And for the first time for me, I'd found, I think, my tribe of people, like people who really, really understood what it was to feel kind of like lost as well, but also to feel like, oh, this is the thing that we do, and this is like one of the things that makes us really, really happy and makes us feel like this is a purpose, And so within that group, we started hanging out a lot together, and we started going to these. At that time, there was this bar in Oxford Street. It was like, when you go up William Street and you hit that Coca-Cola sign or whatever.
Oh, yep.
So they're in
King's Cross.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there used to be a bar in King's Cross. It's no longer there, but it was called Bar Me. And in the basement of Bar Me, they used to have these open mic nights every Monday night. And so you'd go down there, and it'd be packed. It's like the electric environment. It'd be absolutely packed. You'd write your name on a little piece of paper, throw it in the hat. The host of the night would sort of pull it out, and you'd go up and perform songs. And so our whole group used to go down there every single Monday, and we used to go and play our songs. We used to write songs during the week, and sometimes we'd perform them in our class, but then we'd also go test them out here because it was a bigger audience. And a lot of times there was like Australian music royalty that would be like the lead singer from the Whitlams was there. It'd be like Ry Thistlewaite from Thirsty Merc, and Andrew Farris from INXS came a couple of times. Like, for me, it was just it was so exciting. It was so new. And so we'd go down there and test our songs out and really build this whole community around. And so if I hadn't failed my course, I never would have met those guys. And one of my friends in that course, Jess Chalker, she became sort of like this YouTube music sensation in the early days of YouTube. And I became her keyboard player. So I would go and play gigs with her and tour around. So I got a little bit of a taste of that whole thing as well. And she took me in to record stuff for her, and we started writing songs together. She's a great songwriter.
Nice.
In fact, one of my very first major label release was a song I wrote with her and Damien Leith from Idol. And we did a song for this girl, Bella Ferraro. She was like a runner-up in one of the seasons, and we did one of her singles or whatever. Anyway, so that was like one of the critical things. The second story was around the same time. One of my other friends, me and him and two other friends, we started a reusable cup coffee business. That's a whole nother podcast. It was a failed business, by the way. It was a thing that was supposed to compete with the Keep cups. I don't know if you've ever seen them around the place. That was when I was trying to be a model citizen. I thought I'd build this business and then I'd make some money, and then I'd just be able to play music and just not worry about money. And that was this whole pipe dream that I had. It went completely to shit. But one of the guys who was our business partner is a little older than me, and he now runs a very successful marketing company in Sydney. But he's sort of a mentor and a confidant for me. And one of his friends used to run this thing called the Breakfast Club. It was at his place in Haberfield. And once a month, he would have these things called Breakfast Club. He wasn't himself in the music business at all, but he was a connector, and he knew lots of people. He'd invite all his creative friends over, all his musicians. So one time, my friend Raj, he took me to one of the Breakfast Club things. and they had a band set up there. He would make these huge breakfast spreads at his place, you know, just pancakes and eggs and sausages and everything. And so we'd eat, and then we'd sort of jam, and, you know, someone would start and get on and start playing the sort of stock standard songs you hear, like Sydney wedding bands play. It'd be like Never Too Much by Luther Vandross, goes ba 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 ba, and everybody knows the songs. You know, if you're a musician in Sydney at that time, everybody knows, like, you start playing Superstition, everybody knows the key, and like start joining in. So like we used to do these jam sessions where they would just literally go for hours and hours. We'd start, it'd be Sunday breakfast, but then we'd leave at like 7 or 8 p.m. So we'd be in there for like 12 hours. Anyway, so during one of the things, I think it was like Superstition or something like that, we're just playing, and then, you know, it gets to like the solo round, and there's a guitar player just like killing it in the corner. He's this really, really lanky, tall, white guy, but I'm wondering, how's he playing so soulfully? Like, how's he doing that? And so we ended up becoming friends, and his name's Nick Robertson, and me and him started a duo together, and we would end up gigging literally all around Sydney. You know, that was my first real thing of being almost a semi-professional musician. We didn't get paid a lot of money, but we would play everywhere in Sydney. And again, it was one of those things where we were just fortunate to have the timing line up with the opportunity. So one time I was walking down Kent Street, and it was at the time when all the small bars were opening up in Sydney, you know, and it was just this explosion of these small bars. You know, they came out of nowhere, and every single one of them seemed so cool at the time. So I'm walking down past one of them, and I saw, there was a guy playing the keys there, and, you know, there was a little crowd in the small bar, and I just had a thought to myself, like, oh, I could do that. Like, you know, I had that sort of confidence about me at that time. I was like, yeah, I think I could do that. So I cold called the bar later on, and he said, you know, look, you have to put together a little audition tape and send it to me, and maybe I'll give you a gig. So the week before, I'd met this guitar player at this breakfast club thing. So I go over to his place in the sort of far northern beaches, and we did a little demo tape. We uploaded it to MySpace, and I sent it to him like that. It was like one 20-minute set of The Desert's Mr. Rain and Jamiroquai. It was all these kind of songs that we liked playing at the time. And he said, yeah, like, this is really cool. Like, nobody's really playing music like this. Like, come and play at this bar. And by chance, they, you know, the small bars had just opened, and those guys, they were called Small Bar actually, and they had three other bars. They had a bar in Kent Street, they had a place in Crow's Nest, and they had a place in Northbridge. And that was our circuit. So that was our bread and butter gigs. And then we'd sort of go and find other ones around the place. But yeah, so I mean, the point of those two things was that it was all this combination of these things just falling into my lap. And in between then, there's so many other different stories of things that happened and people that I met that sort of shaped my mind to start thinking, oh, I should just find a way to do it and it'll all work out. You know, it's that sort of the thing that really only happens in that part of your 20s, when it's that reckless sort of abandon of like, yeah, it'll work. You're not really thinking too far ahead, you know, at that point. It's a blind faith, really, more than anything else, you know.
It is, and I think it's quite important to have that level of blind faith to almost approach it from an organical sense, without expectations, without any sense of pressure on yourself, and especially for a creative person, that's really important, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You can't be in this business without that, because if you start thinking on the logical tip, your brain will break. Like, the road into the business, it's beyond rationality, you know, and even when you make it, it's like beyond rationality why one person makes it and another person doesn't. We can get into that later, but
yeah, absolutely. And just for reference, because this podcast episode could live on in the ether forever. So what year was this when you were doing the open mic nights and the breakfast clubs and the bars?
This was 2004 to 2007, around that time.
Wow. So that gives our audience a little bit of an idea of what Sydney was like back then, and all the
pre-lockout
moments. Yeah, pre-lockout. And we're not talking about COVID, we're talking about lockout well before. We're talking
about, that's right, real bar lockout.
That's right, that's right. Serious. Yeah, it's just a Sydney thing, unfortunately. But I want to talk a little bit about, from that space, where was that crucial turn that made you move and relocate to LA?
So my cousin, who's a year younger than me, he's just always known he wanted to be an actor, like literally his whole life. He didn't have the problem that I have. I don't think he's ever felt the pressure to fit into anything else, and he's just always been his own person and done his own thing and been really steadfast, I think, about what he wanted. And so basically after his 21st birthday, he left and he moved to LA on the reckless abandon train, you know, just like, okay, I'm just gonna go do this. He didn't know anyone and he just figured it out. And so when he'd been there for about 6 or 7 months, I was traveling around Europe and doing that, and I went and visited him on my way back to Sydney. And I hated LA. I absolutely hated the city. You know, this was pre-Uber, so it was a really, really difficult city to navigate and to get around, and really expensive. And it was kind of like, you know, it's rough, you know, it's not like a pretty city in like Sydney, so or even like New York. It's not a city that when you go to, it immediately hits you and you go, I love this place. It takes a lot of time to really get you, but when it's got you, it's like got you the whole way. And so anyway, I left that whole couple of weeks going there. Like, it was fun spending time with him, but I don't really like the city. But I also got a little bit of a sense, you know, just the energy of the city, something about it it just stayed with me. Something about the people and the characters and the sort of freedom of people and the sort of diversity of everything, you know, not just the diversity of the people, but the diversity of like how they dressed and the things that they were doing. And, you know, it was just something stayed with me in my head. And, you know, I went back, and once again, we're back on this thing of like, I'm trying to be a model citizen, and I went into a postgrad degree, and I was working, and I was trying to get this coffee business going, and all this different stuff was happening. You know, I think that thing just ate at me. I was still gigging at the time, and I just had an opportunity to get at that time, I'm not sure if it still exists, but if you graduate uni within a year, you can get a J1 visa, which is a specific visa to Australia and the US. It's an exchange visa. And so I thought, I have to do this now, or I'm never going to get a chance to do it again, because I'm going to be outside of the year of graduation. And luckily my cousin was already there, so it felt like I had someone there. You know, that would end up being a huge advantage. So that's really what made me move. It was a lot of different things, honestly. Like, I just felt like I had reached the ceiling of everything that I felt about what I was doing and who I was with, and everything about Sydney. I just felt like I had to get out.
Yeah, and once you got to LA, things weren't easy, were they?
Oh, no. Once I had moved to LA, I was basically starting from scratch. Like, nothing I'd done in Australia mattered at all. The one thing that was very clear, even by just some general research that I'd done online, was that LA it's the Silicon Valley of the entertainment industry, right? It's everything in show business in the world. LA is really the hub, and it used to be LA and London. In some way it kind of still is, but in so many ways LA is still that sort of place where, in terms of pop culture, everything streams out from there. It's like the most influential place. So I knew I had to be there, just on a level of discovery, but also in terms of just getting to the place I wanted to be. My whole goal was, I always wanted to be like Quincy Jones. I wanted to be that great, you know. And you have to put yourself in an environment where that can happen, because it's never going to happen from like your dad's garage or whatever. You know, they always say like, you can never be a star in your parents' garage or whatever. So I just knew I had to get out. When I moved, I got referred to this guy just through hustling around, just calling people, hassling people. I got referred to this guy, Barry Squire, and he's a super LA character. He's like Doc from Back to the Future. That's what he looks like, a little bit fatter. He's probably never had a straight job in his life. He's always worked in some capacity in music. He's a really, really interesting, super eccentric guy. His whole claim to fame was he discovered Green Day. He'd somehow become like the guy who was auditioning musicians for all the big live touring acts. So for example, if Katy Perry was going on a world tour, he would audition her band, her backline, what they call that. And, you know, he did everything from the big stuff like Rihanna and Katy Perry all the way down to acts that would just tour the US, which is not a small thing, but it's smaller than Katy Perry. Anyway, so my whole thing was, I only had 12 months in LA, at least of what I knew, because that's how long my visa was. So every day was important for me. So I would just be calling everybody, any way I could get gigs, anywhere I could, not just gigs, but also side jobs, because I wasn't making any money from music for a long time, and you don't, because that's the nature of the game. But I would leave multiple messages on Barry's phone. You know, eventually I got to him, and he let me audition one time, and it was for Billy Joel's daughter. So strange, like that's how it happened. So she was putting together a band, and she had a whole thing at the time, and I didn't get the gig, but Barry liked what he saw, and he liked, my look and the whole thing, and he put me on the list. So I was on this spreadsheet, this secret spreadsheet that he had, and he kept calling me back for gigs, and I landed a couple of small gigs with Randy Jackson from American Idol. So Randy put me in as a keyboard player for a couple of bands that he'd signed to his he had a label deal with Sony or something like that, but he put me in a couple of his bands, and he was actually one of the first guys that was really in the industry that championed me, not as a songwriter or producer, because he didn't know me like that, but as a musician. I was still at that point where I was gigging. The only thing I knew for sure was that I wanted a life in music. You said LA is a hard place to start at, and it wasn't just hard for the first year, it was hard for the first 4.5 to 5 years, for me. And for a lot of people, it's like that,
No, it's a real testament. And I was watching your interview earlier on YouTube, and, you talk about desperate times where you got to the point of, I'm going to leave, I'm going to go back to Sydney, and then you decided to stay. So it's quite inspirational.
Oh, thanks. You know what? A lot of making it is obviously just beating the psychological part of it, and just... I would go through probably 3 to 6 month cycles where I would think to myself, oh, maybe I should go home. And then something small, just telling, like we were talking about before, where things would just fall into my lap, like something small would happen that would just keep me in LA and make me think, oh, maybe I should just stick it out a little bit longer, And it could be as small as not even just necessarily getting a gig. It could be as small as, some manager emailed me back, and now I have a little communique with that person, and even if that never went anywhere, and during that time most of those conversations literally went nowhere, it was just enough to keep me there. And just before I left for LA, I think my parents, they maybe thought, okay, he's going to do a year there and then come back, and then it's going to be back to normal. But I think something switched even for them, where at the end of that first year, and I had to come back to Sydney and then reapply for a new visa. Both my parents have actually been very encouraging from, I think, the end of the first year onwards. And I think they've always had the philosophy of once you decide to do something, you have to see it through. And they also knew, luckily, because my cousin had sort of paved that road in some way as well, they just knew that a year is nothing. A year is nothing. Like people who tell me, oh, they're going to come to LA for a year and try things out. A year is like, you're not doing anything in a year. LA is a really, really difficult place. It's very competitive. Obviously, in show business especially, it's like you're trying to play in the NBA. That's what it is. When you move to LA and you're trying to be in this business, you're in the big leagues now. And that's a very small percentage of the population that can make it to that point, and then everybody else has to find out how to play in the D leagues and in the NBL or whatever.
Yeah. That's a good analogy, because it's those tumble turns of the hope and despair going through the whole process, and just being there at the end of each of those moments and still sticking it out. That's what it takes, I suppose. That's what,
and I do have to give that credit to like my parents, my wife, who'd always sort of stuck by somehow, even when nothing was really going on for me. It's funny because people always ask me, and they know that I have an Indian background, so they always ask me, oh, were your parents really like strict, and did they tell you, oh, you can't do that? And honestly, after a couple of incidences in high school, maybe early uni, I think once they realized this was just the thing, they never ever told me to come back home or any of that sort of thing. In fact, when I would think about it, my mom would just say something like, no, you just have to like see it through, it's going to get better, just some kind of encouragement to keep me trying.
Yeah, that makes a huge difference, the support of your family and your wife as well, being there. I know you don't like to talk too much about your achievements, but just quickly, if you can talk about any specific ones that either defined or pivoted your journey in a massive way, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, show business in general is one of those things where one thing, whether it's a song, whether it's a film script, whether it's one rolled on a TV show, one thing can change your life, and all of a sudden the next day it's like everything changes, and everybody has versions of that moment if they've made it on this side. Like I said, when you're in the business, you're in the NBA. Like when you're in the league, like I'm in the league, All of us in this game have had that moment to get to this point, and it's not about us actually. It's about this sort of perfect storm of things, of all kinds of things that happen to create that moment. For me, that moment was I got invited to a writing camp in Toronto when I had I was at my absolute bottom. APRA, the organization that basically supports Australian songwriters, I had been developing a relationship with them for a few years up until that point. And the director really, I don't know what she saw in me, but she really took me under her wing, and she just believed in me like nobody else had really believed in me up until that point. And she put me forward to be part of this writing camp. And the camp actually had a lot of very, very successful writers and producers at that time, but they wanted some new blood. They wanted like guys that were coming up. So this lady, the director rapper, she put me out. They got me a spot on that camp. Long story short, they paid for everything. I had no money. They paid for my flights and my hotel and everything like that. I went to this camp, and the second day of that writing camp, I wrote a song called Zero. It was a single for Chris Brown, and it was number 7 on the radio, on pop radio, and it's a gold record. And
wow!
By the way, we wrote the song, and it didn't come out for almost a year and a half. So that's how long. So I was still not really making money from music up until that point. And the song came out, and it kind of out the gate was doing really well on the radio and internationally, and that was a massive changing point in my life. I've had a few moments like that since then. In 2018, I wrote a song with Demi Lovato that actually ended up being not just a big record for her, it's a platinum record for her, meaning it's done over 1 million sales in the US. But it was also a big conversation starter because she was the first artist to get really, really open and honest. She's a massive, colossal artist, in this world. We wrote that song in Bali at her absolute bottom point in her life, But when it came out, it wasn't just the exposure of the record, but it became a conversation starter for a lot of artists to start talking about their own mental illness, their own different issues in their personal lives, in their records. At that point, big pop stars of Demi's level weren't really doing that, but she really opened that conversation up. And now it's like, artists don't even want to put out records that don't feel personal on some level.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think when you're at the absolute bottom, like you said, that's where the real things of value come out, don't they?
Yeah. And there's something about, there are some moments when you're writing and when you're in the creative space, when you're actually making something, where what it feels like is, for example, that day, Demi was in the room with us. It was me, Demi, my friend Mark, and my other friend Sam. So it was 4 of us. We were writing in the room, and it took us like 8 hours to really, really flesh out the song. But what it feels like when something great is in the room, it actually feels like the song is already there in the room, and you're just kind of like reaching in the air, trying to like find it and put it together. And that's what that energy feels like. That's what it felt like that day. And during the Chris record, that's exactly what it felt like. But we got there in 20 minutes. We wrote that song so fast. I did another song for Zayn and Nicki Minaj. That was similar. We did that in about 45 minutes probably. So that's kind of what that feels like when you're really, I think there's like this combination of like purpose, and then when you're in flow, everybody's just, it's like Power Rangers,
Yeah, it all comes together, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's the best thing ever. It's the best. Like, I mean, I've had songs on the radio. I've had songs that the Demi record is at, I don't know, it's at like 190 million streams on Spotify. So there's stuff like that, but there's nothing better than that moment in the room when that you have something, and there's nothing that beats that. Yeah, to this day.
Yeah, but behind those 20 minutes or 40 minutes that you can conjure up this writing, there's, years and years of effort that goes in behind the scenes that, you embellish on and you try and take advantage of to write that. So congratulations on such a brilliant achievement, especially with the Demi Lovato on that, because I've been listening to that song on multiple occasions and I had no idea that you were involved with that at all till I saw your interview more recently, about a year and a bit ago. So I want to talk a bit more about that creative process you're talking about. So when, let's say, an opportunity arises, so a collaboration or a project comes up onto your table, where do you begin? Where does that inspiration come from?
Whew, that's a good question. It's different every time, because when we, there's a couple of different sort of permutations and combinations in how we work. Like as a producer, sometimes I'm writing with the artist. Like sometimes, for example, with Demi. Other times I'm writing with other songwriters, and we're not necessarily trying to write for another artist. We're just trying to write a really good song. So in the case of the Chris Brown record or the Zayn record or even the BTS song that I did, actually the BTS song was specifically for BTS, but the boys weren't there. But yeah, basically, we're just trying to write great songs. So that process is different depending on which route you're doing that with. I guess in both cases, whether you're with the artist or you're just in the room writing with your friends, part of the producer's job is you have to create a safe space for bad ideas to exist as well. You have to create a space for people to feel comfortable to just lay everything out there, to tell you their deepest and darkest. And that's one of the stranger sort of things that happens in our business is, we write with people that we don't know. We write with people quite often that we just meet on the day, but we have to somehow create a world where like people feel comfortable telling you everything about themselves, in that time. And so quite often what I do is, if I'm with the artist, is, it's these chats. It's those first sort of half an hour. That's where you sort of try to find the magic or some little thing that you can hold on to, whether it's a lyric idea that comes from a story, or whether it's, some little chords or some little sound that I'm playing, and maybe that just sparks an idea. And everything just needs a little ignition. And that's kind of what the producer's job is to sort of like find that ignition source, and then to build the whole thing out from that.
Yeah, and to someone from the outside, it all seems so complicated and it all seems vague. So how do you sharpen that tool?
I mean, the truth is it is vague and it is complicated. Like nothing about music, even just like we were talking about, even just getting into the business, nothing about it is a straight path. Like everybody I know in music, in the songwriting side, I can count on my hands how many people that I know that write these songs that we hear on the radio and all that stuff, how many of them went to school for music. Everybody came at this from a completely different path. And part of the writing process is like, obviously you have a set of tools in terms of the craft that you understand. You understand how melodic choices should be made in different sections. If you're a producer, you understand arrangement, you understand sonics, you know how to mix. I think a producer's job nowadays is probably more broader than it's ever been. In terms of the amount of disciplines you have to be basically a master at, and the way we do it at this level is like, by the end of the day, you have something that sounds like it could exist on the radio by the end of the day, and if not, obviously when it gets to it coming out, you're doing revisions and things like that. And so to get back to the question, there is no single way. Like every time it feels like it's different, even though there are definitely ways to start. Because the other thing you're dealing with is not just from a technical point of view from the music, but you're dealing with a different set of personalities that may want a completely different thing. So you have to, part of it's the personality management side. But on the other side of things, there are definitely times where an artist will come in and say, I want a song like X. And then it's about, okay, how do we start with that as the base? For example, I want a song like Don't Start Now by Dua Lipa, which is a very popular thing that is happening in writing rooms nowadays. So a lot of people are doing disco now. So we might start at the same tempo, okay, with the disco beat, with like similar thing, we create a little beat. But then where it goes from there is whatever, we just have to start with the feeling. Pharrell says this in one of the interviews. You're basically trying to reverse engineer a feeling, right? That's kind of what happens. It's just you get a song and then you're trying to reverse engineer it. You're not trying to reverse engineer sonically what that is, because that's copyright infringement, but you're trying to reverse engineer what that feels like. It's that perfect balance between technical know-how, and in the pop music game especially, you really do need to understand technique. You need to understand melodic intervals. You need to understand arrangement. You need to understand how, if a melody starts here, this is where it should end up in the chorus. This is how many times a thing can repeat. And it's like we talked about, if music is the language, if that's the language, then pop music is like the most global language. It's like the way you can say the most complex thing with the least amount of words and with the simplest ideas. And so to understand that language, you have to go through a whole cycle of understanding all the complexities about what music can do. And then you understand the language of music. So like you know, you might have an A phrase and then a B phrase, and then you want to repeat the A phrase again so people hear that again. It's all building blocks of a language. So you do have to understand that. But then how you get to a song that's a hit is you have to know the blocks, you have to know the rules, and then you have to know how and when to break them. And that's where you find the inspiration, the layer that exists kind of on top of that, where everybody goes, oh, this is like something I've heard before, but it also sounds like fresh and new and cool. Because actually, because the truth is, every hit song has the DNA of another hit song in it, or multiple hit songs in it. You know, I like we're talking about the Dua Lipa record. That to me is like, and you know, that's produced by my friend Ian Kirkpatrick. He's an absolute beast, you know, and a guy that I looked up to coming up. But that song feels like Sophie Ellis Bextor and Jamiroquai if they had a song in 2020. You know, right. There will be something in the technical side that is very similar as well. A lot of times it's, you know, whether it's a chord progression, whether it's like sonically a sound, whether it's like a small fragment of a melody. I mean, one of my favorites is, you know, there's a Swedish producer, Max Martin, and he is sort of like pop Jesus. You know, if anybody doesn't know who he is, go look him up. And he's done every great pop record of the last really 30 years. And he's, you know, a lot of the way that we write from a technical standpoint now is he's the guy that wrote the book on that. You know, somewhere between him and Paul McCartney is like the entire foundation of how we write pop songs nowadays. And there's a song called True by Spandau Ballet. It's an old song from the 80s. It goes, ah, 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 I know this much is true. It's like a famous song from the 80s. There's a melody in the bridge. It's not even in the main part of the song. It's in the bridge. It goes, dum, 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 dum. And then he took that melody. It's being played by like a xylophone. It's a completely different instrument. If you go listen to Spandau Ballet, True, it's in the bridge set. It's like 2.5 minutes into the song. But he took that melody and then he used that for ain't nothing but a heartache. Tell me why. So everything is like, you have to find the best ways to like make things familiar. I mean, I can tell you lists of, I mean, even in songs that I've done, you know, there's stuff that we've definitely taken inspiration from as well. But every hit song has the DNA of another song in it. So familiarity is very, very important in terms of, because if you think about it, that's the easiest way to connect with a person. And the idea of pop music is to communicate with millions of people. So it's all about connecting with people on that level. It's like, then you open the door, then they come in, and then you show them all this new stuff, and they're like, oh wow, like I trust you because you told me there's this other thing that we both like. Like, yeah, it's like developing a relationship with your listener without actually interacting with them in a typical sense, I suppose. But yeah, right. But you are interacting with them. And then the beauty of that is, and this is, by the way, this is not even a thing that is specific to pop music. It's like Mozart used to blatantly rip off like melodies from composers before him and just rework them. A lot of the greats in the classical period, what they were also great interpreters of ideas that had already existed. And that's a thing that's a constant throughout history. Every genius, you know, quote unquote, it's the Shakespeare thing of good poets borrow, great poets steal, right? It's Michael Jackson did it. Like everybody you know that you think is great is also a great interpreter. And so the beauty of that is for people like us that write, we sort of feel like this is our little contribution to the world, right? This is our little contribution to popular culture. At the same time, it's also a thread to music throughout the entire of human existence. It's like, this is the oral tradition, you know? Every idea, you can trace it back, and then you can trace the beginnings of pop music back to blues, back to ragtime, back to classical. You can literally go all the way back. So this really is the language that like connects our entire civilization. You know, this is kind of like a broader way to look at it. Yeah, it's quite fascinating. And before we talk more about music philosophy, which I know you want to talk about, maybe you can give our audience a little bit more of an idea of how you go about the arranging process. Maybe, you know, would you mind going through one of your tracks and show how you go about bringing it all together, all the different elements to create that emotion you talk about? Yeah, I think it would be cool to actually go through the theme song that I did for you guys, and that could be a cool little intro to part of how that works. Perfect. That sounds like a great idea. Today we are doing the masterclass for the Atomic Shift podcast. And I thought instead of looking at a whole song arrangement, sort of going into the nuts and bolts of that, which is probably at least an hour of a masterclass, we'd
have a quick look at something I did more recently, which was the theme music for the Atomic Shift podcast. So let's just have a quick listen at the music real quick. Here we go. So you get the basic idea. So for me, in terms of creatively, where does this piece come from? How do I start with it? So for me, the idea was, okay, this is music for a podcast. It's likely going to be chopped down into, probably less than the first 10 seconds, which is what you hear at the beginning of each episode. But even still, it's good to kind of flesh out a whole musical idea so that the clients, in this case, the writers and the producers of the Atomic Shift podcast, they're able to chop it down into something that suits them. And in terms of from a creative point of view, I had to think about, okay, what does the podcast represent? It's about different ideas, different perspectives. It's got to be slightly edgy. It's sort of discussing things that you wouldn't otherwise maybe think about, or you wouldn't otherwise get the perspective of, interesting guests. And so I went sonically, I decided to go in the vibe of this sort of lo-fi, sort of drum and bass, heavy funk thing, which sort of gives it a little bit of that edge, but still keeps the central musical idea very, very simple. And so the whole piece of music is centered around this bass idea, which you get in the first 4 bars of the track, which is this. So this is a bit of arrangement 101, really. We have a very simple musical idea, which is a riff, this bass riff here, and I've actually played it on my Fender fretless jazz bass. I don't have it in the studio with me today, but the whole piece is centered around this one idea. And one of the sort of key elements of arrangement or production is you have to set up the musical idea and then work around that. So that means throughout the arrangement, what we're doing is we're building on this central idea, which is the bass riff, and we're building stuff on it. We're adding drums, we're adding different parts to it, and we're taking things away. And that happens about, you can see on the map, roughly around every 4 bars, something's changing. So that's not a hard and fast rule, but it is pretty much a go-to rule for arrangement, especially in a popular music format, which that's the arrangement that I've chosen for this piece. So once we get into the 4 bars of that, we're adding the basic element of this drum groove right here, which is over here. So that's the basic that's the vibe, We've got the bass and the drums, and the bottom end is always super, super important in establishing really everything about the feel of these kinds of tracks. So what else do we have here? We've got this, by the way, this drum groove here is just a bunch of drum samples that I've chopped up, you can see, and I've actually processed them in a few different ways. You can see what I've got with this shaker here. If you listen in headphones, you can probably hear it panning left and right. Got a little bit of a panner on there. So all of that stuff is really to create movement. And once again, if we look at this, the way the track develops every 4 bars, you can see different elements being added, and the shaker gets added for movement in this section here. Now, once we get to this section, we can hear the very first of the what's technically called a counter melody. So it's this guitar piece. All right, so the idea behind that is that's actually, I played it on an electric guitar and heavily edited it because I cannot play that fast. And what I wanted to really get with that, with this sort of counter melody, is I wanted to add a little bit of an Indian element to it, since we've got that representation in the podcast. And so, you know, it's my take on very, very well commonly used riff, or, you know, cadence in bhangra, which is that has that real swing to that ding ding ding, that whole swing to it. So let's have a listen to just the guitar. Now I've put a bunch of effects on there because just the guitar alone, this is what it sounds like. Wow, it's just so lifeless and dull, and you can hear that. And so, you know, these are more, now we're getting into some of the more technical sides of production. So I've added a distressor here, which just gives it some, gives the sound some color and some saturation. I've added some light distortion. It's actually not that light, it's quite heavy. And then I've got this sort of flangey effect. Let's hear it without. So you can see when I put that on, it gives it a whole body and stereo sort of space that just wasn't existent before. Then what I'm doing is I'm sending it to another two set of effects. And this one is really, really important for this, because what I really wanted was for the guitar to have a space after the melody. So it plays the melody, but then you have to sort of hear the tail of that. And that's the kind of thing that gives it a, you know, quote unquote vibe. So let's hear it with the space real quick. So you can hear that the sound sort of tails off. So for that, I've got this Modely, which is just an effects panel. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that I've tweaked on this that's giving it that tail that rides out. And that's really important, just because in this section, there's a whole bunch of space after here. But I want people to remember this idea and to have the vibe continue. So yeah, a lot of these smaller decisions that we make from a sound design perspective on individual sounds, they are really there to create movement or space and vibe and feel in the track. And in this section here, which is basically, this is kind of like the chorus. I've added one extra guitar thing here. Yeah, so this is the chorus of the track, and this guitar here, what it's really doing is it's basically doubling the bass riff. So that's one of the other 101s of production, is you have the central melody, the central idea that's happening in the track, and in the chorus you accentuate it by having another instrument play the exact same thing. So this is obviously playing it a little higher. So all of a sudden we have so much more energy in this section right here, you know. Let's play it all together. And what am I doing on this sound? We've got a little bit of sound design stuff in there. I've got a distortion plug-in over here. You can see I can crunch it a little bit. And then what I'm doing here is EQing. We'll get to that later on, but this is a very, very important part of production. Okay, so actually let me add one other thing to this. Let's see, what's the best way to do this? So I want to actually create some stereo width in this sound. Let's go for double. Now you probably just heard just how nice and wide that made the sound. And then in this little breakdown section, so what I really wanted to create here is, you know, we need, even as we move through the arrangement, we need a section where we're building some tension before we bring back the central idea, which is this bass riff over here. And what we're doing here is I've taken the bass riff out, and we've got a whole nother section of thing coming, but you have to constantly let the listener know, okay, we're building into this tension, we're building the tension, and we're going to bring it home and come back to our central idea. So here's one of the simple ways to create tension is you do what we call a pedal, which is just hang on a single note on the tension note of the key. So that's just doing that, and we've got it EQ'd. So that's actually from an analog synthesizer that I've played. But you can see it's really just doing the simple singular note leading into the final sort of section of this, and then I've got these guitars playing a sort of it's almost like a reggae type rhythm, actually, weirdly. So these are two guitars, panned left, panned right. I've got them going into here, and we've got a whole bunch of effects on there. Now, one of the things I wanted to touch upon is, from a production point of view, what you really want to do is, from a sonic perspective, you have to create a full spectrum of sound across the sound frequency spectrum. So, for example, with this bass, one of the ways we are achieving that is I'm keeping all the bass in the lower frequencies here with this EQ plugin. So everything below 1000 Hertz and above about 25 Hertz, I want the bass to occupy the majority of this room in the whole audio spectrum of the whole track. So what that allows is it helps the listener have really, really clearly identifiable parts exist in different parts of the frequency spectrum. And obviously there is going to be crossover, and you want that crossover because you want it to feel organic, and you need some of that dynamic to happen from a sonic point of view. But you also need to isolate certain frequencies for certain parts of the music, and that helps bring them out, and it helps them make them very clear in the arrangement, and it allows the track to breathe, and it allows the track to feel much cleaner in the mix. So with these drums, let's have a look at so the drums are pretty much playing across the frequency spectrum. You can see there's a dip here. And that's because I want the guitar and the bass to sort of live, and the other instruments really to live in this frequency so that they can show off more. We want the bottom end in the drums because we want the kick to really punch out, and we want some of this expensive top end to show off the cool percussion happening at the top end. For me, specifically in this section, I wanted this sort of cowbell thing to really come out. Yeah, I love that bit. Alright, so here we go. So let's have a look at the end. So yeah, let's keep looking at that EQ side of things. So with this guitar, for example, we have guitar mostly taking up this space. What I would normally do, I kind of rushed this track, but what I would normally do is EQ some of this bottom end out. We don't want any of that mud to take away from what the bass is doing, especially since it's the central element of the arrangement. And so yeah, after the breakdown, we have if everything's going back in. And you can see here we've got a nice little fill, which is basically, this is an old school drum machine fill. And you need fills and different elements to basically transition from one section to another. That allows the listener to sort of know, okay, something's coming up, something's going to happen. We're going to move into the next section, or we're going to move back into a full other section. So that's that fill. But there are also these other transitions that I've got here, which is just some pretty standard reverse sweeps and fills to move ourselves from each section. And so that's basically the production for the Atomic Shift podcast theme. Now, obviously, most records are much more complicated, and they involve a lot more a lot more production knowledge in terms of how to treat vocals, how to treat different types of instruments. I've gone for a pretty simple instrumentation here only because this is a theme for a podcast and needed to be simple, and it needs to state the musical idea very, very early on and establish that very early on and not have too many parts in it, because it just doesn't need that for this particular medium. So that's something to always keep in mind when you're producing. What is it for? Who are the intended audiences? Where are they going to listen to it on? I was very aware that mostly the Atomic Shift podcast would be listened to on a laptop or through headphones, not necessarily in big expensive studios or in really hi-fi sort of sound systems. So the way that I've approached this from a sonic perspective is I wanted to keep everything in the mid to high range, so that these are the elements that come out when you're listening to it on these kind of mediums, laptop speakers, off your phone, etc., etc. And so these are some of the things to keep in mind. And this has been the production masterclass for the Atomic Shift podcast, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please follow me on Instagram at springloaded. I do a lot more complex stuff on there, as well as share some of the work I do over here on records and in TV and film. Thank you. Thanks very much for joining me, and be in touch.
Well, Tushar, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I mean, it really provides us a bit of an insight into how you go about it, especially for us from an Atomic Shift point of view. That's really the behind the scenes of our theme track. So thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah, sure. No worries. It was fun.
Awesome. So coming back to music philosophy, we were just talking about extension of the oral tradition and the kind of legacy that you leave behind in bits and pieces through your work. But how do you define success in your industry? Is it really about how many people you reach, or is it about that moment you talk about when you're with the artist and you have that creative genius moment? Where do you define success for you?
That's a difficult question, because the practical point of view, from like the physical, like the world we live in, the definition of success within our business is obviously, and it is the music business, it's not the music friends, it's not the music anything else, it's the music business. So at the end of the day, the definition of success within the industry is, who do you have records out with, how many sales do you have, how many gold and platinum records, it's those kind of things. And then obviously it's the stuff like, if you have Grammys and if you have other accolades, there are things like that do matter. In pop music, the awards matters less than, do you have the big song on the radio? Do you have the big song on the charts, But I think that individually, in terms of how we as the creators define success, it absolutely cannot be about any of that stuff. It can't be about the numbers. Once you make it about that for yourself, you'll literally go crazy, because it's interesting because, you're interviewing me at a time when I'm actually not having a run, and music is a very streaky business. It's like you have years where you have loads of songs come out, big hits, and you have like lots of success. And then quite often that's followed by dips of you're working, but nothing's necessarily connecting. I write about 100 songs a year. If 15 to 20 of those songs actually come out, that's a good year. You guys have caught me in an interesting time, because I'm past the bottom of my bottom streak, I think, over the last year, and so it's sort of made me reflect on, like you said, like what are the things that you define success by. And I think for me, you have to bring it internally, and you have to define success as whether you're improving at your craft, and so that's more on the technical side. And then on the other hand, it's like, are you developing relationships that are going to get you to that next level? Because, 70% of this business, maybe even more, is actually not just about the song. It is like being in a professional sports league, right? Everybody that's in this game is like really, really good. And if I played you the songs that are on my hard drive, or if any other writer that I know played you the ones that didn't come out, you would wonder, how did that not come out? How is that not a hit? But that's the quality that we're talking about. And so the thing that separates, okay, this song made it to be this person's single, and then this really connected with an audience. There's so many things that happen that are just not in your control. And so, more than anything, I think for me personally, what I've learned is that not just, and I feel like this is not just applicable to my success or success in music, but it's applicable to a lot of people who have really great success, maybe outside traditional areas. One thing I really have realized is it's actually not about me. There's so many things that have to come together for those things to exist and be successful that you can't define it by those numbers at all. So you have to find other ways of defining success. For me, one of the things I define success by is, am I still working in music? And I don't have to do anything else. Like, this is what I do. I write songs every day with my friends. That's my thing. I travel. Like last year I did almost 12 international trips. I've worked in Korea. I've worked everywhere around the world. People fly me overseas to like write songs for them. Like, that is success to me. You know, I don't have to do anything else. Part of what motivates me, honestly, is fear. It's like, I think if you can take fear and harness it into a positive thing, that's a way to find success. I am afraid, deathly afraid, of going back to that old life in Sydney. That drives me to be successful. So you know, that's kind of one of the ways that I personally define success by, is like, am I able to continue to do this work, and is that all I have to do to live, and to live comfortably? And you know, right now the answer is yes. So that's one way I think I define success, and that's one way a lot of people in this business have to define success, because the material stuff is very, very fickle, that side of it. Even though, honestly, even the relationship side is, because it's Hollywood at the end of the day. So people are going to jump on the stuff that's hot, or the people that are really buzzing. And, you know, you just have to ride those waves.
Yeah, and that's a great way of, you know, summarizing that. So the way you can harness the fear, and that can find you success as you do that. Moving on to, you know, if you take the business aspect out of it and you just look at the music itself and your personal growth in terms of how you see music differently as you have all these extremely creative experiences, what is it in terms of value and meaning that music adds to you in your life as a person?
Ooh, that's really interesting, because that also tends to fluctuate, you know, depending on, because you know, when music is your job as well, there's definitely days when the last thing you want to do is listen to music. My whole life, I've never been able to study with music. You know, even in high school, a lot of people like used to study with. I've never been able to do that, because for me, like I said, it's another language. So it's literally like somebody talking in my brain while I'm trying to study. So it's still like that today, where once I'm listening to music, it's very hard for me to do something else, and my brain is like automatically deconstructing all the different things, the arrangements, the melodies, the lyrics. Not only that, and then on the business side, it's like, oh, how did they get the song to this person, and then who's involved, and it starts being a whole thing. So there are days like that, and then there are days when all I want to do is create. So, you know, what does it mean? It feels a bit more like esoteric, because it is just like a part at this point. You wake up and it's just there, you know. I think a lot of the times, even before I was like in music, I have very vivid memories of even growing up and in high school. I just have something playing in my head. It just never stops.
Yeah,
it's like a disease.
Yeah, and we were talking about this with Gunnar, who's an instrumentalist we had in one of our first episodes. The best way to figure out how much value something has is imagine a world without that thing in your life, and imagine to your best ability what that would be like, right? And it's hard with music, because it's such an integral part of who we are. Like you said, it's the soundtrack to our lives. So it's so difficult to imagine how we would be without music as a construct.
It's so hard. Yeah, it's such an innate thing, and it really predates language and all the other things that we've built on top of that, right? It's like the first person just beating a thing on a rock on the thing. Is like, that's music, you know. It's almost cellular, you know. I'm not just talking about myself. I think it's just like that for all of us. And
yeah, it's incredible. Also, just in terms of, I know you do some background track work as well for film and documentaries and things you work on. Where do you draw the line between, am I taking this too far? Am I dominating the image, or do I support it? How does that come about?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because it's an entirely different headspace from doing songwriting stuff. And on the business side, it's also an entirely different set of people that you're dealing. It's an entirely different industry, really, on its own. So you have to sort of shift your entire way of existing when you're in that world, you know, not just creatively, but everything. And you know, I say this because, you know, I know you, when you ask a question, it'll be like, we've talked about the business, but now let's talk about this. But the truth is that it's actually very, very interleaved, all of these things. And nowhere is that more so the case than in film and TV, because the saddest part in a way is no matter how famous like a score is, you know, everybody knows the John Williams score from Indiana Jones and Jaws, and everybody knows this music. But the fact is, in film and TV land, music is actually the last consideration. It's normally like the very, very final thing that they take care of. And so you're just part of like a bigger machine. But actually, you know, as the guy that's creating the music, that it's the most important thing, because everybody knows about the studies of watching movies without music, etc., etc. For me, it's always about the stories. In 2019, I was scoring a movie with Babyface. It was the Bobby Brown biopic. It was the movie did really well. It was like the #1 cable movie in the States at the time it came out. And our whole philosophy behind that was, how do we assist the story? And that's the general principle of how you approach composing for film and TV. Is it's always about assisting the story. I think the challenge now in 2020 is audiences are very, very sophisticated now. I think people are more exposed to like cheesy score. You know what I mean? Like people don't react to that. They actually recoil. Like when people, and that some of that still exists and it still works in certain things. Like in Bollywood, because of how broad the audience is, that's a different genre of scoring. So in that genre, because you're playing for literally people who are illiterate all the way up to people who are very, very, you know, on the other end of the spectrum. So for some of that, you have to score very broadly. But for what we do in the States, you basically can't be telling people what to feel. That's the key thing. In a sad scene, you don't want that really sad violin to play really, really loudly. But you have to hint at it. You have to say, you should be a little sad at this point. You know what I mean? It's finding that balance. But it's all about assisting the story. I think subtlety has always been my main thing when I'm scoring for any multimedia stuff. And yeah, the approach is really different. I personally love the exercise of it, because for me, it feels like I'm not having to create from scratch. So I'm just trying to help somebody else's vision along. And yeah, that can be good and bad, because some directors have a really, really specific idea of what they want, what they hear in the music, but they can't necessarily communicate that. So it's also our job as the composer to take their language and to communicate it in the music, because they don't know how to speak the language. We know how to speak it. Our job is to interpret it. So they'll say, you know, we had the director say like, this scene should sound more orange or something. It's something crazy, but you have to interpret what that is.
That's interesting. And the whole point of our podcast, at least, is to help people shift their thinking about something that they thought they knew how it worked, and listening to people like yourself thinking, wow, I didn't think of it that way. And this is a big shift for me in the thinking. Is it seems like music composing or production or even writing, it's more a linguistic exercise. It's more about interpreting emotions and then, you know, testing and experimenting. It's almost more engineered than I thought it was. So that's a huge shift for me. So thank you for opening our eyes on that.
I think that's a good point to touch on as well, just in terms of like some of the community aspects we were talking about. I think there's a lot of a general idea in environments where like professional artistic industries don't really exist on this level. For example, like, you know, growing up in Sydney, there's this general idea of, if you're trying to be a working artist, it's like somebody who sits there in a room and is trying to wait for inspiration. And, you know, I don't think people really see it as a discipline or a craft in that way. And when you're doing it especially at a commercial level, and you're trying to live off this stuff, it really is that, you know, it's not engineered to the point where you're killing the inspiration, because people recognize when stuff is overly produced as well now. But it definitely is like a real discipline. And I think people, you know, back home, I always felt like people who are doing creative stuff, it just gets relegated to, it's like a hobby, or it's something you do on the weekends. But the truth is, to be really great at it, you have to be obsessed with it, and you have to eat, drink, and sleep. And that's why I always make that analogy of the professional athletes who for some reason, for literally being the same thing, people look at them completely different. They understand the discipline and the hard work that goes into being a professional footy player, or being, you know, but they're not going to give the same perspective to like the professional musician. It's really the same thing, you know. And in some ways it's similar also, in the sense of like, you can't come at it late. You kind of have to have been involved at least on some level from a young age as well, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and you have to kind of have it in you as you grow up, so you can learn it through that process. But I do want to talk a little bit about the future of music, especially composition and production. There's this idea, there's techniques and software that can actually compose their own music using AI. How much of that have you looked at, and how much of it do you think is a risk to the industry?
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I'm actually working on a tool myself with a couple of partners. Yeah, and we're in the process of we're doing some really, really interesting stuff. So stuff that I'm excited about. But in terms of the immediate future, you know, I'm talking about the next maybe 4 or 5 years. I think we're going to see a lot of these artificial compositional tools. I'm not afraid of it, to be honest. I think at every level of innovation in technology, what it basically allows humans to do is the work above that. So in terms of what we do as producers, you know, we find sounds and we play them, and then we mix and we manipulate the audio and stuff like that. A lot of the work, I would say maybe 50 to 60% of that sound manipulation work is something that if you programmed a machine to do it, it could do it in like a second, where it would take a couple hours for us to really dial in a sound or sonically achieve that same thing, you know what I mean? And so I think where the limitation of those compositional tools is currently is the easiest way to say it is that none of it is good. That's the easier way of saying it. Yeah, it's not, I don't think anything that exists out there is really, really picking up on the rules that, and like I said, a part of it comes from the fact that the recording business, like you said yourself, is kind of opaque in a way. You know, people see it as this thing, but nobody really understands it. And people in the business don't really, like, I have a publishing deal, you know, with Warner Chappell, meaning they administer my rights, you know, so they collect royalties on all my songs. But I don't really understand how the money flows. I understand it on some level. I understand the idea of a master recording and I understand how the mechanics work, but I don't really know. And so the compositional tools are a bit like that, is they know some stuff, but they don't really know the full piece of how do you write a hit record, which I think is what everybody's chasing right now. And so I think a lot of these new tools, they're actually going to supercharge the songwriting process, because it's going to allow us to focus on the human element of it, which is the lyric and the vocal melody stuff, you know, vocal production, you know. So yeah, I mean, I think it's good. I think you can't stop it, and you have to find where you can advance and where you can exist. I also think it's going to make people who actually play music, like, because there are a lot of producers and you know, what I call beat makers out there, like guys that just make beats. They don't play any instruments. So I think a lot of the technological stuff that's happening, it's going to almost make actual musicians more valuable again. So you know, we're going to see a lot of that, because where the magic is in terms of production stuff is we'll do 95% of a composition in what they call in the box, you know, on the computer with these keyboards and synthesizing different sounds. But then we'll do one thing that's real, you know, and what I do a lot of is I'll do a track and then I'll like play the actual guitar, you know, I'll really play, or I'll play like a real bass, and just that. And that's the innate thing about the music thing, is those songs that have that one organic element, they always connect better, always. And that's why songs like Circles by Post Malone connect. That's why songs like even the new Weekend stuff, there's one thing that's real in it.
Yeah, and I think there's that synergy between an instrumentalist and their instrument that's quite unique, and it's not replicable in a AI sense, is it?
It's hard right now. I feel like, you know, the limitations of AI seem completely boundless. So it's hard to say that it can't do anything at this point. We don't know. But yeah, in terms of the immediate future, I don't necessarily see that happening. You know, a lot of people are afraid of that as a thing that kills music, but you know, people were saying that about CDs, and they said that about Napster, and you know, in the last 2 years the whole music business revenue model has shifted, but the commercial value of music is back to where it was before Napster, you know. So we found a way to make money again from music, which is good, because we can create an environment that advances the art forms.
Yeah, and lots has changed in that space. I think people are more willing to pay for a subscription now, and people like myself who used to download music off Napster now all have Spotify accounts or Apple Music accounts, and we and we feel like we're contributing and not leeching off the industry, which is a good feeling, actually.
No, it's great. It's great. And then there's a whole generation of people growing up now who don't even know Napster and LimeWire the way we did. You know, they don't even know. They just know subscription services.
It's great. And before we finish up, I just wanted to see if there was any advice that you can provide to anyone listening to this podcast thinking, wow, this is the kind of work that I want to be doing. What kind of advice would you give them?
Well, just write every day. What I still do to this day is try to get better at one new thing every day. And then, you know, you'll see that adds up. And, you know, if there is anybody out there that's really on that path, please, you know, email me. Every weekend I have like an allocated time where I go through demos that get sent to me from different people all around the world and different writers. And I'm always interested to discover that next person. So please reach out to me on Instagram or whatever.
Perfect. I'll make sure that we share all your links and your emails. Do you want to quickly tell us where our listeners can follow your work and send that email to you?
My Instagram is @springloaded, and then my email is thatproducer@gmail.com.
That's easy enough to remember. So I'm sure we'll have a few emails coming out of this podcast towards you. Yeah, we'd love to hear your feedback maybe at another time, at another episode maybe.
We hit on this a little bit, but I'm definitely interested in, you know, nurturing. I feel like in my own journey, there are people that sort of paved the way for me to be here. I would love to do the same, and I'm actively trying to do the same for somebody else out there. So if there is someone, then, you know, please hit me up. I'm still waiting to find someone who's really, really good.
I'm sure you will, and we'll put the word out for you, that's for sure. Well, thank you so much, Tushar, for joining us today and really helping us understand this opaque business that is the music business.
No, thank you for having me on, and I know that there's some gaps in our conversation here. Maybe we need to do a part 2 or something like that. But it was fun being on here. Thank you for having me.
100%. Looking forward to it. Thank you.